How's it going, guys? Today we're going to have a quick test review over chapter 21, which is Absolute Monarchs. I want to go over the theory of absolutism, a little bit about the Spanish monarch, French monarch, Prussian monarch, and lastly, the Russian czars. Okay, so the causes of absolutism begin with the theory that absolutism was derived from various sources, including the Bible and practices of ancient civilizations. Absolute monarchs practice the divine right of kings, which is to rule and authority given to monarchs directly by God. In other words, the king was God on earth, and any law he became accountable. Challenging the king's decisions, choices, or laws was the same to challenging God. And lastly, monarchs became very powerful through their colonial possessions that we discussed during the Age of Exploration. They obtained a great amount of wealth, and they were self-sufficient and did not really need things or items from other countries or people. So let's go ahead and start with Spain. The Spanish monarch, first of all, is named King Philip, and King Philip was a defender of the Catholic Church. He fought against the Muslims and the Jews and the Protestants. He spread religion throughout his empire and his colonial possessions, and he made sure to send missionaries to the Americas to convert the Incas and the Aztecs into Catholics. Much of King Philip's wealth came from his colonial possessions in the Americas. He was giving tons, or boatloads, if you will, actual boatloads of gold and silver. Although he was a monarch, he did have some problems. Some of the problems were that he had inflated prices for, materialistic things like water, because there was an excessive amount of silver. So the more silver people have, the more expensive things will become. Another problem is that he removed the Jews and the Muslims from the Spanish Empire and reduced the amount of money he had. So because he was a defender of the Catholic Church, as we see here, a lot of people fled his empire, and those people that fled his empire, around 300,000, fled, and when they fled, they no longer had to pay taxes to the king. So without taxes, there is no governmental money. And again, as a defender of the Catholic religion, he fought costly religious wars, which increased his debt, who he had to pay back to Italy or Germany. And lastly, the Spanish Netherlands under William the Orange fought for independence and gained their independence from Spain. King Philip II is a monarch because he was in control of his religion. He had a lot of artistic splendor with the Spanish age of golden arts and literature. He took control over his colonial possessions, and he laid heavy taxes on his people. That's why he is considered a monarch. Next, we have France. Now, when we're talking about France, we're going to focus on a few people in power. We're not going to call them. There's two monarchs and two cardinals. First monarch is Henry, and the second is Cardinal Richelieu, then Cardinal Mazarin, and lastly King Louis XIV. So Henry IV was a Protestant. He later converted to Catholic. He declared the Edict of Nantes, which provided religious toleration for all his subjects. He rebuilt France's economy with the wealth of his colonial possessions, and he's considered a monarch because he strengthened the monarch by ending a generation of war. He welcomed peace to France and promoted religious compromise and stability. Eventually, he was stabbed to death. Okay, so that's why Henry the Fourth is a monarch. Then we have Cardinal Richelieu, and Cardinal Richelieu was in charge because King Louis XIII was too weak to be king. Cardinal Richelieu was the leader of the Catholic Church. Obviously, he's a cardinal. He focused on fighting the Huguenots and the Protestants throughout his time. Although the Edict of Nantes was still existent, he still fought against them. He ended the idea of religious toleration, and he forbade, the practice of Protestant worship. The wealth, again, came from the colonial possessions, and he was considered a monarch, or he was considered someone in power, because he limited the power of the nobles in France by forcing them to remove fortified castles. So those wealthy landowners had to reduce the amount of power they have, and the only one that had strong power was a cardinal. Then we have Cardinal Mazarin. Cardinal Mazarin comes to power after Cardinal Richelieu. Now, Cardinal Mazarin, again, he'll be Catholic. He made France very strong towards the end of the 30 Years' War, which gave France the ultimate amount of territory and power. In the 30 Years' War, you can see it kind of like a war between all of Europe, all fought for, territorial boundaries along with religious problems. So at the end of the war, France kind of had a lot of power, a lot of territory. They were the ones that were doing the best. A lot of the other territories were destroyed, the fields were changed, the boundaries were destroyed. The wealthy families did not have as much power. So Cardinal Mazarin increased the taxes, and when he increased the taxes, the nobles who were already upset about Cardinal Richelieu, because first they removed their fortifications. Now they have to pay a heavy amount of taxes. Then they cannot practice their religion. So the nobles began to riot and destroy and plunder the city. It was riot after riot, and everything was chaotic again. Cardinal Mazarin was in charge of France during the life of King Louis XIV. King Louis XIV was only a kid. He was only a child when he came to kinghood. Cardinal Mazarin was around during this time, and the interesting thing is that the nobles wanted to kill the king. They threatened Mazarin over and over again. So Cardinal Mazarin can be seen as a leader, not a monarch really, because he ruled for Louis XIV as he was a king, well, as a child. He made France was already powerful because Cardinal Richelieu limited the nobles' power, but he also strengthened the government. Okay, he strengthened the government by taking the money away from the people. So both Cardinal Richelieu and Cardinal Mazarin, who were in charge, one, limited the power of nobles. Two, focused more on the Catholic faith versus Protestant. Three, strengthened the central power of the government. And lastly, we have King Louis XIV. Now, King Louis XIV was a very lucky guy because when he came to power, he already had everything paved for him. There was a strong, power in the government. There was weak nobles. There was heavy taxation. There was money in the banks, and there was kind of like a structure already created for him. He was again a Catholic king, and the first thing he did for religion was that he canceled the Edict of Nantes, and he left the Huguenots. The Huguenots, who were French Protestant, left France in fear and persecution. So when he canceled this edict that gives people religious toleration, which is the Edict of Nantes, religious toleration, many people left France, fearing for their lives. And it was a fear for their lives because war had already devastated their lives, and that's all they knew. A lot of the wealth that Louis had was by taxing the nobles. Okay, he created a group of intendants, and these intendants would go and they would collect taxes from the people, and they would administer justice where justice had to be served. One of his, personal, I guess, economic advisors was Jean-Baptiste Colbert, and he practiced a theory of mercantilism, which basically states that France will sell more goods than it will buy from other countries. So if you sell more, foreign countries are going to give you the money, and you will be in charge of manufacturing and selling the products. So a lot of King Louis's wealth came from the idea of a revolutionized mercantilist type government. Why is King Louis a monarch? Okay, first he said, "L'état c'est moi." I'm not French, but in English that means I am the state. And he became king at 5. He forced local officials to communicate with him on a day-to-day basis, kind of like keeping the whole country on check. He built the palace at Versailles, which is a magnificent place, very luxurious. He was a patron of the arts, and what that means is that he sponsored the arts. He was about comedy, about the ballet, about the opera. He was huge on arts and, drama and comedies. He was a big artistic man. And he forced nobles, in a way, to be his servants. And what I mean by that is that the nobles were, had to give a certain amount of time every year to kind of like be Louis's servants, or like kind of like groom them, help clothe them, help bathe them. And we covered that in class when we looked at the daily life of King Louis XIV. So he kind of, had the nobles literally at his hand as servants. He taxed the heck out of them. He eliminated any other religious toleration contract like the Edict of Nantes, and he called himself the state. So his legacy is that of a powerful monarch because he had total and absolute control, which is what a monarch is. Then we have Frederick the Great and Frederick the Elector. These two guys are from Prussia. First guy we're going to talk about is Frederick William, or the Great Elector. And he comes to power, and when he comes to power after the 30 Years' War, he finds it necessary to have a strong army. The concept is that the nation's army is its powerful source. It's not the money, it's not the manpower, it's not about the glamour or the splendor, it's about how many troops you have ready to fight. So the Great Elector's idea is that a strong standing army, that of around 80,000, will protect the state in case there's crisis or war. And his idea was that people in military should not have comedies, drama, ballet, all of those things that King Louis had, and also the Spanish Empire had were like weaknesses. He was a monarch because he introduced taxation to support his military state. He weakened the power of the Junkers, which are nobles in Prussia. He weakened the representative assemblies, and he forced the Junkers, who were the land-owning nobles of Prussia, to sign on and be trained in his idea of military campaigns. So whenever there was war or conflict, the Junkers were the people that were commanding the armies. So Frederick the Great, or the Great Elector, whatever we want to call him, Frederick William, or the Great Elector, the guy on top over here, he was a monarch because of his idea and controlling of people in reference to military. Lastly, for Prussia, we have Frederick the Great. Now, Frederick the Great was the Elector's son, and he was not like his father at all. He loved music, he loved literature, he loved all the things that would make a military man weak. And Frederick the Great was more of a poet. He was bisexual, and as a teenager, he ran away with his boyfriend. His father found out, and he had his boyfriend decapitated in front of him because he disobeyed. But eventually, as he gained power, he rose to the idea that military was necessary. And, he pursued his father's teachings on having a strong standing army and continued to practice, military strategies. He introduced iron ore, textiles, food, and different products to his people, which made Prussia a little bit stronger. That is why Frederick the Great is called a monarch. And he's also an enlightened monarch because he helped the serfs out and he gave them certain statuses that they did not once have. Then we have Russia. And there's two people in Russia we got to know about, Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great. Ivan the Terrible's name sums it up, basically. He was a terrible person, and he was a terrible person because his wife Anastasia was murdered by the Boyars, who he believed, orchestrated this poisoning of her. And he was good in the sense that he won many military victories, added lands to Russia, gave Russia a code of laws, and he ruled justly. It wasn't until the death of his wife Anastasia that he became this brute czar, or monarch, which is, a leader. And as a leader, he killed a lot of boyars, executed him, his wives, his servants, and his serfs. And then he would steal the boyars' land and gave it to those who remained faithful to him. So he's a monarch because he had absolute power over the boyars. Then Peter the Great comes to power. And Peter the Great reformed Russia. He is also an enlightened type leader. He ended serfdom, meaning the serfs could not be sold as property, and they can now flee if they don't like the lands they're living in. Like before, they were property of the land. And Peter the Great westernized Russia by educating the people, creating the first newspaper, increasing the rights of women, and keeping up with the Western fashion in society. He also created the warm water seaport in St. Petersburg. Okay, so when we're talking about absolute monarchs, guys, we're going to understand the importance of absolute monarchs. Each one of them had great things they did, great contributions. Good luck on your test.